Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and this is the Roundtable number 36. I am joined by my very good friend and a delightful man. I mean, his just awesomeness is just eclipsed by his big brains. This is Alexander Mercouris of the Duran. Alexander, my friend, so good to have you on again.
Well, my friend Gonzalo, it's wonderful to be on, and thank you for those extremely kind words. Rather flattering, but always lovely to
Uh,
hear one spoken about in that nice way.
if the Twitter or Facebook fact checkers check what I just said, they'll just say, "Yeah, it's true." So it's a delight as always. And by the way, for those of you listening, in the description below, you'll find links to Alexander's channel, and you can follow him also at the Duran with Alex Christoforou. That they do daily broadcasts. That they are the top of the line insofar as geopolitical analysis is concerned. And it's a pleasure. And the thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to step back a little bit, because as I was telling Alexander before the start of the show, we tend to focus on the minutia of the day, of what happens, today. And what I wanted to do is take a little bit step back and talk about the leadership class of the West and how they are, forgive me for being vulgar, Alexander's the gentleman, I'm the Bulgarian, but they are screwing the pooch, the Western leadership class, something awful. And so I figured that it would be a good time to take a little break and discuss them because of something that happened with Angela Merkel. Alexander, you want to start off with the Angela Merkel situation, and then we'll move on from there?
Absolutely, but can I just follow on from what you're saying, Gonzalo? Because, of course, the real story about this crisis is the collapse into incompetence of the Western leadership class. That is why we have a war in Ukraine. That is why we could have a conflict in Taiwan. That is why Western economies are in a terrible state. It all originates from this one fact that ultimately the leadership, the quality, the caliber of leadership in the West is becoming completely dreadful. Now, you now bringing me to the one person who dominated European politics, Angela Merkel, for, well, about a decade and even longer. She was Chancellor of Germany for an incredibly long time. She was the mistress, basically, of German politics. It's extraordinary to see how quickly people have turned on her. She's now, where she'd been built up into this colossus on almost every side, she's now been criticized. And she's coming out and she's trying to defend her legacy. And she gave a very interesting, very revealing interview to Der Spiegel, which is a German magazine, which, by the way, was very plugged into her chancellery when she was chancellor. So a lot of the things that she wanted people to know, she managed to filter them through Der Spiegel. So, they had a close relationship in the past. But she gave this very interesting interview. And the part I'm going to focus on is the part about Ukraine, because that's obviously the big story. It's the big story in Germany too. And the thing that came across to me is, firstly, Merkel is German, Russian speaking, supposedly a person of enormous competence and extraordinary ability. A person who was talking to the Russians all the time, who had one-to-one meetings with Putin without interpreters there. She didn't understand him. She didn't understand the Russians. She didn't really understand how important Ukraine was to Russia. And she saw everything with the same cynicism that she used in her approach to German politics and to European politics, only to an even greater extent. So she seems to have persuaded herself that she could somehow bribe or bully the Russians into doing what she and the West wanted over Ukraine. So when there was a crisis in 2015, she needed to maintain a good relationship with Russia because she had enough intellect, enough understanding of the importance of Russia to Europe to understand that a crisis with Russia would not be good for Europe. So she went off to Moscow. She had a one-to-one meeting with Putin. She persuaded Putin to agree to this Minsk Accord. We now know that it is largely her creation. Minsk agreement was largely her creation. Putin agreed to it. The Russians agreed to it. It was going to be the roadmap for peace. We had them all going off to Minsk. There was this meeting with Poroshenko. Very reluctantly, he signed it. And then, of course, it became immediately clear, entirely obvious, that Poroshenko was never going to implement it. And the Ukrainians were never going to implement it. And Merkel did two things. Firstly, she insisted on maintaining sanctions on the Russians until the Minsk agreement was implemented, when she knew that it wasn't the Russians who were obstructing it, it was her own Ukrainian friends. And secondly, and this is where I found her interview with Der Spiegel really becomes incredibly interesting. It's clear that what she was trying to get the Russians to do was to drop Minsk, to accept that Minsk had failed, to hand over Donbass to Ukraine, because that's ultimately what it would have amounted to. And in return, Merkel believed that she'd be able to bribe the Russians for this by lifting the sanctions and getting some other kind of deal done with the Russians. And she never accepted, or could bring herself to accept or understand, that the Russians cared about Donbass. And that, of course, was the seed of our present disaster, because her inability to see that the Russians care about Donbass, and her inability also, by the way, to accept that the people of Donbass have their own agency, that they're not just Russian stooges, which is what she also seems to have assumed or wanted to believe. Well, that is what has led us directly to this present catastrophe. So she began at some point to understand that things weren't shaping up. She was trying last year, as she says, to set up meetings between Putin and the Europeans. The Europeans, by this point, were losing interest in Merkel because they knew she would be gone fairly soon, so they weren't interested in this meeting with the Russians. And she also says that the Russians weren't interested. And she attributes this fact to her own imminent loss of power in Berlin, the fact that she was no longer going to be chancellor, or wouldn't be chancellor for very long. But she doesn't seem to have grasped that by this point, the Russians didn't trust her, because she'd led them up the garden path with Minsk. She'd got them tied down into 8 years of fruitless negotiations, and just telling them at the same time, well, let's stop worrying about Minsk. And of course, that wasn't something the Russians were ever going to do. And it's clear that by last year, trust between Merkel and the Russians had, to all intents and purposes, completely broken down.
Yeah, exactly right. And by the way, a quick parentheses. I want to thank Susie Q and Zariel, who are doing the moderation in chat. Chat, be nice. They're the bosses there. And yeah, what you're saying is absolutely right. What I want to focus on is the cynicism of Angela Merkel, and cynicism and blindness, because she clearly thought that basically Minsk II was a sop to the Russians. I mean, that's how it is. And at the same time, an inability, a blindness to see Russian motivations, which are perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's perfectly understandable if you understand nationalism and how the Russians are a nationalistic people who believe in their country and love their country. Whereas, let me venture to make a speculation argument. Whereas perhaps Angela Merkel, because of the post-war situation in Germany, she doesn't understand nationalism. She doesn't understand the notion of protecting your people and making sure that your people are all right, and that they're not being invaded or threatened or put in a position that is untenable. I mean, do you think that might have played into it?
Absolutely. And I mean, having been somebody who's been to Germany many times, I think that is absolutely correct. I think there's no doubt about this. I think the Germans, at a fundamental level, have a very great difficulty understanding that people in a country like Russia care about these things, that they're prepared to make sacrifices over them.
Yeah.
Because in Germany, people haven't made sacrifices for that kind of issue for a very, very long time. And if you're talking about Germany, the history makes that understandable why they would feel that way. But of course, it isn't just the Germans. I mean, it's also very much part of the general European outlook today, which is to downplay nationalism wherever you can, to ignore the fact that people love their countries, that they want to be, act in the interests of their countries. In the European Union today, acting in the interests of your country is a dirty word.
Yeah,
what you're supposed to do.
Is.
What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to be prepared to sacrifice the vital interests of your country for the great European project. I mean, that's very much the sort of outlook. And it was the Russians aren't that way at all. Yeah. But on top of this, there is this other profound sickness that we now have in Europe. And it's also true in the United States. In Europe, I think it's particularly severe, which is that because we have this situation where with the European Union, there's constant haggling, there's constant intrigue. It's very much a system now based on intrigue. It produces the best it can produce is an Angela Merkel. Merkel is, if you like, the epitome of the system. Every other European leader is in effect a lesser version, if you like, of Angela Merkel, because Angela Merkel's skills were always manipulative. There were always skills of manipulation. It was nobody ever said that she had vision, because she didn't. Nobody had ever said that she had an idea of where to take Germany, because frankly, she wasn't interested in that sort of thing. And that's true of the Europeans altogether and in general. And of course, when they're confronted with another country, which in this case Russia, which thinks in a completely different way, they find that an impossible thing to understand. And of course, from the Russian point of view, I mean, seeing politicians who come along, tell them one thing, do something else, are always there, openly interested in bribes and bullying and things of that kind. Again, one can sense that it steadily filled them with disgust. It's a feature, by the way, of very cynical people, that they assume that others are cynical in the same way that they are. They find it very difficult to understand that that is not the case.
Yeah, exactly. Because, from my view, it seems that the leadership class in the West, they have no overriding principles, no long-term goals for their nations. And they seem to approach every crisis as sort of like a game of whack-a-mole. Just knock it down and go on to the next, and say or do whatever is necessary to pacify the current crisis and just knock it down so that they can continue sailing on without any notion that there are long-term objectives that you should be keeping in mind. I mean, policy-wise, you should be thinking of it as North Stars that are guiding your nation. But it's not just Angela Merkel. It's Macron, Olaf Scholz. Who's the latest British Prime Minister? Wait,
Sunak.
Which one are we on? Oh yeah, that guy.
Sunak,
or maybe it'll be Rees-Mogg, next month. Who knows? But I mean, you see my point. They only seem to be. It's a short-termism that, of course, we're seeing it in the United States as well, which is extremely dangerous, because since it's all short-term crises, they consistently, because of the cynicism, they only seem to know how to double down. They don't seem to know how to step back and say, wait, is this good for us long term? Because they have no vision of the long term. I mean, you have consistently said that the neocons and the cabal in Washington, insofar as foreign policy is concerned, they just know how to double down, and that's it. But my thinking, I agree with you, but my thinking has been they constantly double down because they constantly think of every crisis as something to be solved as expediently as possible, irrespective of any kind of principles. And so when they see that one solution to a particular crisis isn't working, they just say, okay, let's just do more of the same and see if that'll work. Just increase the medicine as opposed to stepping back and saying maybe we're treating the wrong disease, if you will.
Absolutely, yes. It's entirely true. It's exactly correct, because, of course, what they never see is that the crisis, the fact that there are these recurring crises, is a reason that there might be an even bigger crisis, which these little crises are just the symptoms. So what they're doing, in effect, is they're finding ways not so much to put out the fires as to sort of lock the fires away. You sort of push it into one place, shut the door, move on, and then something else comes, and then you have a haggle, and then you push it round, you throw more money at it.
Actually,
a lot of what they do.
I have a metaphor. What they do is they see a fire going and they put it in a box and close the box. And when the fire consumes that box, then they put it into an even bigger box.
Exactly.
And constantly, the martingale strategy of gambling. Yeah. Because
that's
ahead,
very
please,
good, actually.
please.
Yeah, that's a very good way of describing it, because that's exactly what they do. But they never look at the underlying things. They never strategize. Strategy isn't something that they are able to do any longer, nor are they able to sort of take a step back, look at the larger picture, say to themselves, where are we going? Where is the West? Where is Europe? Where is my country heading? What are the priorities that we need to work out today? So back in the 1960s, for example, the Willy Brandt had come along. He'd been mayor of Berlin. He'd seen the wall built. He said to himself, well, confrontation with Russia is leading us nowhere. We've got to change our policy. We've got to do an Ostpolitik. We've got to reach out to them. That's important for us. It's important for peace in Europe. It's important for peace in the world. There is no one like that today. And the system works to prevent anyone like that ever emerging. It constantly does exactly what you say. It puts each problem into a box. The boxes simply get bigger as you put more boxes one over the other.
Yeah, and so I wanted to ask you, what is going on in in the manner that we are picking our leaders, that is leading the Western democracies to pick these individuals who are so short-term minded? And why is it that, in contrast, you have leaders in China, in Russia, and in India, and most other countries that do have this long-term view? I mean, you see the point I'm trying to ask you is
Absolutely.
What are we doing as a culture, as a society that is producing these leaders? Because these leaders don't come from a vacuum. They come from somewhere. They come from us, basically. What do you think is going on? I have my suspicions, but I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about that.
Before we analyze that, let's just actually illustrate the very point that you were making, because we've just had this G20 meeting in Bali, and it was fascinating to see the difference between those countries which had real leaders, China, Russia, India, Indonesia, all of these places. They were all getting together. They were talking to each other. They were agreeing substantive things with each other. And we've seen a whole lot of more substantive things happening since then. I mean, we've seen Russian-Chinese trade increase. We've seen more deals between the Indians and the Russians. We've seen the Indonesians doing their big play. We see all of that. So we saw that. And we saw the Europeans and the Americans, and they come along to these meetings, to the G20, and it's all about not being part of the same picture as Lavrov. It's all about getting the words in the communique, so we can somehow accept these words in the communique. It's become essentially an issue of triviality and process. Whereas the others do the big things, all we can do is the small ones. Now, I've been sort of reading the international media, and not just the Western media, and it's clear that more and more people around the world, for them, Bali was a revelation, because, of course, the West has up to now always seemed, powerful. It's the forefront of human civilization. It has the power, it has the leadership, it has the vision, it has the technologies, the industries. And suddenly, the G7 instead of looking like these big, towering figures that they were in the past, they look like midgets. They look
Yeah.
like, midgets who found themselves into a room with giants. And
Yeah.
I think that this is underestimated. Now, why have we got into this position? Why do we see leaders of the kind that that you've been talking about? What's happened? Well, I think part of the answer to your question is contained in your question when you mentioned the word democracy, because
Mhm.
of course what's happening, and one doesn't want to go down into all kinds of elaborate theories, but what is happening is that in the West, in Europe and in the United States, a political class has emerged
Mm.
over the last 50 years. And it's a political class that includes the entire political system, all the big political parties, the media, the civil service, the establishment, all of those sort of things. And success in politics is no longer achieved through elections, through talking out to people. It is achieved by who is most successful in getting the support of the political class. So it's a major step away from democracy as it
Mm.
used to be practiced in the West.
Yeah, that's pretty much my conclusion as well, that we have created a professional political class, just as we would create a professional, I don't know, watchmaker class,
Mm,
where we have people
mm,
who have no real world experience. They
mm,
go from university, elite universities,
mm.
the Pose in France and the Ivy League in the United States. I don't know I mean,
Well, it's
Oxbridge in the UK.
In Oxford. I mean, there is the PPE. There's the degree, the PPE
Hmm.
degree,
Yeah,
politics,
yeah, but
philosophy, and economics, which is the
and
one that people who want to go into politics takes. So it's
yeah,
Oxford.
and
Well, it's Oxford,
my
specifically Oxford.
okay, I
Yeah,
believe you, but it
yeah,
goes from university
yeah.
to a think tank to
Mm,
some low-level government position
mm,
that where they get to basically network, and they
yeah,
just climb the ladder of their
yeah,
party or the bureaucracy, and they wind up in positions of power, but they've never really interacted with the people,
yeah,
and they're kind of like totally dissociated from the people. I mean, when I
mm,
speak about the cosmopolitan Western leadership class, cosmopolitan means international. And it is an international class that they have everything in common with each other, but absolutely nothing in common with the people
mm,
below. And they don't even understand their justified grievances. For instance,
mm,
Trudeau with the truckers, for instance. The
mm,
truckers had legitimate grievances. And the
mm,
whole notion of the Trudeau government was just to whack-a-mole, just whack them down and not
mm,
address those
mm,
legitimate grievances.
mm,
And before the broadcast started, you were mentioning about the situation, the food situation in
mm,
London,
mm,
and that's something that the professional leadership class would have no idea about. Sorry, chat. What Alexander and I were talking about was that he was
yeah.
saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that there were no eggs and no chickens or turkeys in the
Mm,
supermarkets
mm,
in London. In
absolutely.
London,
Yeah.
I I mean,
I mean,
please expand on that and tell
It,
me more.
it's all attributed to avian flu. That there's supposed to be an outbreak of avian flu, but I've read lots of articles which say that this is simply asking, saying it's avian flu isn't even remotely addressing the real issues. But the point is, there's a massive shortage of eggs, of poultry, and we actually see other shortages of food now starting
I'm
to
still here, by the
crop
way.
up.
I'm just going inside
Yeah,
because it's
okay.
cold. But
Yeah,
please go ahead. You're
but
saying there's a
point
massive shortage of
the point
poultry?
is absolutely, but the point is, of course. So I mean, trying to get a turkey for Christmas, unless it's frozen turkey from long ago, or fresh food, fresh poultry is becoming increasingly difficult. I mean, just to say, I went to a very celebrated shop in Piccadilly. I spoke
Mhm.
to the person who was retailing things there. He said to me, "If you want geese, well, just forget it. You're not going to get them. They're not available anymore. They've gone. Or and
Because of
whatever there
Putin?
is,
Because of
well,
Putin? I
because of
knew that.
Putin, exactly. So anyway, but the point is, it's not really talked about in the media. in Britain. I mean, you go to the British media, you will not read about the fact that we have increasing food shortages in London. You won't read, and I've shown photographs I mean, these are personal photographs because I don't want to take photographs of people in embarrassing situations and then just publish them. So but I've circulated them to my friends, but photographs of places where people buy secondhand clothes, knock down prices. They're now open in the streets. There's soup kitchens in the streets. There's signs in the grocery stores, the supermarkets about how, if you're not using your food, if you buy more food than you need, just give it back to us so that we can pass it on to soup kitchens. All of this. We also have strikes now in many parts of the economy. We have railway workers striking. We've got other people striking. Even lawyers are striking, by the way. I mean, there's
it's being suppressed,
and yet it's being suppressed. We barely read about this. If you follow British politics today, which is a depressing thing to do, by the way,
yes, it is. I'm sorry,
it's essentially all about intrigues. It's about the intrigues that are going on with the Conservative Party. It's the intrigues that are going on, the political battle. And it's not really a political battle. It's the positioning between various members of the political class, between the Labour Party, which is essentially very little different now from the Conservatives. But everything in the media today, apart from foreign policy, which is of course Ukraine, that's all people talk about there. It's basically all now about the internal machinations of the political class. What is happening outside the bubble of the political class, which is essentially geographically restricted to Northwest London. People within the political class don't see. So I was traveling around the English regions a few weeks ago. I was astonished to see signs, the increasing signs, depressed to see the increasing signs of distress that I saw there. Even in parts of London now, which have never been reached by economic crisis before, I was astonished to see how bad things are. So I mentioned the fact that I went to this famous shop in Piccadilly in a desperate effort to find a Christmas goose. But what I didn't mention was that Piccadilly, which you've been in London,
I lived in London.
You know that it is one of the richest streets in London. It's got all the great shops there,
richest in the world.
Hotels, one of the richest in the world. Well, I would say that about a third of the shops have closed.
Right. Yeah. And the political class is not paying attention to that at all because they're locked in their bubble.
They're locked in their bubble. As I said, Rishi Sunak gave and his chancellor did a budget which was all about basically raising taxes. And that was all it was really all about. But again, if you read the British newspapers, it's less about what the effect of this will be on people. It's more about, will this cause the Conservative support to increase or fall? What's going to happen with the Labour Party? Will Keir Starmer be able to capitalise on it? As if anybody outside the political bubble cares about these things. But it really is. It's becoming, British politics is becoming like, sort of Soviet-era Kremlinology. It's becoming increasingly that sort of thing. And you find the same pattern repeating itself in country after country. I think in the United States, it's perhaps been taken to an even greater level. But you see it now everywhere, that the political class is united about one thing, that control should be maintained by, itself, and not by outsiders. So, we don't want Donald Trump. We don't really want Giorgia Meloni, but she's, because she's got the wrong accent. She's from the tough part of Rome. But, we might be able to find. She's not one of us. Exactly. She's not one of us. Exactly. Yeah. So we want to keep things to ourselves. And of course, what we also want is we have this constant battle within us, within our group, as to who's going to come on top. And coming back to Merkel, who we were discussing before, that was her skill. She was incredibly skilled in working the political class, keeping the whole thing in Europe under her
Trundling
kind
along,
of
yeah.
control, trundling it along.
Yeah, because the thing that I'm noticing about the leadership class in the West is that it's becoming Soviet, like late stage Brezhnev era kind of thing, on the one hand, and also it's becoming increasingly authoritarian and starting to dip its toes into totalitarianism, quite frankly, because I mean,
absolutely,
the idea is to control everything. And that's something truly bizarre, because you as a former lawyer and myself, I've done different businesses. We are aware of the limits of our power and control over things, and we recognize that there are some things that are just beyond our power to control. They just happen, and well, if it goes good for us, great. If not, well, so be it. But we understand that there are limits to our control. But this leadership class, which grew up in an era where the unipolar moment, if you will, a post-Soviet breakup, and even during the 80s, the late 70s and into the 80s, when it was really the West was the game, and the Soviet Union, everybody recognized, was sort of like coming apart at the seams. They seem to think that American power, Western power, is limitless. And so they think that they can apply this limitless power to control. And one of the things I find amusing is that they are at the same time trying to control everything and tamp down any opposition. And yet at the same time, they don't recognize that the power that they inherited is rapidly dissipating. They're losing it. And for instance, to give a specific example, I was listening to John Mearsheimer yesterday. He gave an hour-long interview on Unheard. I suggest you watch it. It was very interesting. I'm going to do a video about him and about this particular interview, because what was interesting was not so much what he was saying, which a lot of things geopolitically was, common knowledge, things that you and I would say would nod along to. But what was interesting was his blindness, because he assumed that the American military, NATO, would be able to just show up on the Polish-Ukraine border and just sweep through, and it would be no problem whatsoever. I mean, he had this internalized notion that Western military power, and I'm just mentioning this specifically, but it's indicative of a wider problem, that Western power was limitless, that there was no end to it. And they don't understand that they have been frittering away their power over the last, at least the last 20 years, certainly since the global financial crisis. And they are acting as like trust fund babies, spending money at the casino, not realizing that their trust fund that had billions at one point now is down to the last few $1,000s. You see what I'm saying? I think that's a toxic mix between the desire to control everything, and they're going to have a sudden realization, hey, we're out of power, we're out of juice. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely, and I think this comes back to the nature of the political class in the West, because I mean, you made a comparison with a watchmaker, for example. A watchmaker is limited by the materials he works with. It's a very hard, demanding, difficult thing to make a watch. It really is. To be a member of the political class, provided you have the right connections, is actually relatively easy. And you are not constrained by, physical limits. In fact, you have no physical limits. You have no limits at all that you're aware of, because everything operates in this artificial bubble, if you like. So you have a situation where people do not understand or recognize that they have limits. They're not really experts. I mean, they're experts in political manipulation and control, but they're not expert in anything else. They don't having a government of watchmakers would be a lot better, because watchmakers understand limits. These people do not understand limits because they've never had to really face them. And the reality is that one of the reasons we are losing our power is because we don't understand that our power has always had limits. There's, in JFK's day, just to cite one person, and I mean, I have a lot of issues. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I think JFK was the greatest leader, but he did lead the US, if you like, and the West at a time when you could say they were at a kind of peak.
Yeah.
But he was very, very conscious of the limits within which he was working. I mean, he always did. I mean, you wouldn't. These people had a good understanding that you just couldn't do anything. You couldn't just send troops to one place and somehow that would magically solve the problem. JFK famously said about Vietnam, sending troops to Vietnam is like taking a glass of water, drinking the water when you're thirsty. The effect runs out, and before long, you're thirsty again, and you need another glass of water. He understood that there were limits to what the United States of that period could do. The political class today not only doesn't understand that those limits exist, what's very dangerous about it is that within the political class, it is a heresy to say that there are limits.
Yeah. It reminds me of like cults. The cult can never question the leader or the fundamental tenet. Okay. And it seems that is one of those tenets, that there are limits. If you question it, and if by inherently saying, maybe this isn't a good idea, that's what you're saying. Yeah. And the other thing I've noticed, that they have no notion of secondary and tertiary effects of any policy that you implement. There isn't even the notion that they think that every policy can be targeted to a very specific thing for a very specific outcome, without any conception that human relations, certainly geopolitical relations, tend to be mechanistic, where all the gears are intertwined. And they have no notion of that. And we're seeing now, of course, and you've mentioned this in broadcasts, of how this conflict with Ukraine, and how, as far as I'm concerned, the Russians very brilliantly managed the diplomatic effort starting on February 24th. The Indians all of a sudden are like realizing, we're in bed with the Russians, and they're kind of like shocked about it, because before they had gone on a couple of casual dates, and here they are, naked and having a high old time, and they can't. They're shocked by it. Sorry for my vulgarity. I said at the outset that you were the gentleman and I'm the vulgarian, but that's the only metaphor that popped to mind, to tell you the truth. But I think it's an accurate metaphor.
Yeah. It's a good one. It's an absolutely good one, because I think that's exactly right. I think the Indians themselves have been surprised at the fact that they have ended up so firmly, connected with the Russians and pushing back against the West. And not only that, but they're also surprised that they're actually
having a good time.
It's actually working for them.
Yes.
I mean, if anybody had asked, Modi, I mean, I don't speak to Modi, but I think if
you don't, you're obviously. I'm not so sure I should have you along.
the leaders around, the people in India, I am sure if they had been told a year ago, well, if there's a crisis in Ukraine, will you side with the Russians against the United States? Well, people would have said, absolutely not. Inconceivable. We're not going to do a thing like that. We're not going to commit to one side like that. And especially not the Russians, who are clearly the weaker party. And yet they found that that's where they've ended up. And far from being the problem for them that they might have expected it would be, might have thought it would have been, a year ago, if anybody had floated that idea to them. Well, what they found instead is it's working for them. They're able to sell oil at a premium to the Europeans. The Europeans have no choice but to buy it. They're developing closer and ever closer relations with the Russians, and they're able to use that to leverage the West to get things from the West. So, yes, the Russians have handled the diplomacy with brilliant skill, and that's something you have to give to them. And
here's my question. Sorry to interrupt, but here's a question I have for you. I've been thinking to myself that when the conflict started, initially we can all agree, I think, that for the first 30 to 60 days, the Russian ambition was to have a quick settlement. And perhaps the Zelensky regime would fall and be replaced by somebody friendlier, or even if not, that they'd somehow be able to negotiate a solution. But after the 30, 60 days, or whatever line you want to draw, I think that they deliberately kept it slow insofar as the military, so as to have the space and the time to manage these relationships with China, but especially India and Turkey. Would you agree with that assessment? Do you think that,
I,
I mean, the Russians, we all know, they don't go to the bathroom unless they have a plan. Do you
yeah.
think that the military strategy was deliberate to be slow, grinding, attritional, so as to provide the space in terms of time to cement these relationships with India and Turkey and to a lesser extent China?
It's always difficult to say because, of course,
I
we
mean, it's
don't know what the
impossible,
internal
but
thinking is.
yeah.
But personally, I do. I think
Mm,
that is exactly what happened. And I think the breakthrough moment was the SCO summit in Samarkand in
mm,
September,
yeah,
when
yeah,
I think the Russians finally realized that they got all the pieces, all the diplomatic pieces in place. And
yes,
for me, there was this extraordinary photograph, which I think I circulated, in which you see this room, this gilded room in Samarkand, and there's Putin, and he's got the president of Uzbekistan, and he's got the Kazakh leader, and there's Erdogan, and they're all clearly relaxed and confident with each other, and they clearly the thing's in the bag. And then after Putin comes back from Samarkand to Moscow, you have the whole series of decisions which have probably been worked through. Exactly. So, I mean, the mobilization, the appointment of Surovikin, the creation of the coordinating council to run the military side of the economy. I don't think it's a coincidence that all of this happened after Samarkand. And so I think they did. I think that they also strategize, because I think they've worked out the West pretty well. We have this
mm,
expression in England, you give the other side, the other man, the rope, give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves on it. And I think that's exactly what the Russians did. They let the West overinvest in Ukraine, give far all these weapons, heighten the rhetoric, talk about a Ukrainian victory, and make it fairly clear that that was what they wanted. Want regime change in Moscow. So, coming back to what you said, the Russians made a serious effort to achieve a diplomatic outcome with the Ukrainians at the start of the war. The outside world was looking at all of this, and it said to itself, the Russians want diplomacy, they were seeking peace.
mm,
It's the West that is aiming for victory. Therefore, in reality, it's the Russians who are defending themselves and
mm,
the Western powers that are the aggressors. And if you listen, as I do, to leaders of global South, especially African leaders, on when they come on to the British media, about the only people on the British media, by the way, that you hear who take a contrary view on the Ukraine conflict, they say these things, and you
mm.
can see the British interviewers incredibly angry when they hear them.
Yeah, I know. Because unfortunately, the mainstream media is a part of this
Yeah,
professional political class, and
absolutely.
so yeah, and so yeah, my thinking is that the Russians seem to have stretched it out so that the
Mm,
rest of the world, the global South and the East, could
mm,
see for themselves what NATO was doing, and
yeah,
essentially have a tacit message, which is today us, tomorrow you.
mm,
And I think that's why all of the other countries outside of the West are just you know collapsing and getting behind the Russians, as it were.
yes,
I find it extraordinary because 18 months ago, no way would we have been talking about the connections that are suddenly forming, and also what it seems to me. Here I'm going out on a limb a little bit because I don't know enough about the topic, but it seems that many of the
mm,
internal divisions between these countries are being ironed out because they
yes,
perceive it as a crisis, not just NATO versus Russia, but NATO versus us as well, because we will be next on the list. And so
mm,
a lot of the frictions that had existed before between the
yeah,
various countries, typically India, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, they
yes,
seem to be mellowing out and sort of like getting solved because they seem to be, it seems, as if
mm,
they're saying to themselves, hey, these crazy ass Westerners, they're going to come for us. So let's fix our
Mm.
problems so we can present a united front. Is this putting it a little too far, or would you
I
agree
think
that is more or
no,
less going on?
I don't think it's putting it too far. I mean, there are problems. I mean,
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia and Iran there's still lots of
Oh, it's
issues
like that.
between them. I mean, there's still difficulties clearly there in that relationship, even though it does seem that things have eased significantly. We've seen that, Armenia and Azerbaijan, they still have their issues, even though there are apparently steps being made there to sort them out. India, China is the most important. And it's remarkable, actually, how the heat seems to have gone out of that issue.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
what the West did, and here again, it's the Russians do clever things. The West sometimes does stupid ones. The West
Shocker.
told the entire global South, look, we're not interested in your problems anymore. There's only one problem that really matters, and that's Ukraine. So you've got to side with us on Ukraine, and we're not interested in the fact that you might have problems here and problems there. And of course, people in the global South saw that, and they said, well, we don't like to be taken for granted and treated in that way. We have the Russians who are very, very concerned about us and are really trying to help in all kinds of ways. We have the Chinese as well. And we're not going to be just dragooned by the West into taking a position on Ukraine, because that's important to the United States and to the Europeans. That's a neo-colonial thing. It's a problem in Europe. We have other problems, and they're at least as important, and they're more important for us. And if the West takes this deeply manipulative approach to us, well, we're going to prefer the other side, which takes us seriously.
Yeah. And by the way, about Saudi Arabia and Iran, I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong, both of them are applying to the BRICS to be BRICS members, right?
Yes,
And
exactly.
so once they're in the same house, things might accelerate in terms of smoothing out the issues between those two countries. And that would be enormous because they have a huge control over the oil supply to the West.
Well,
Do
indeed,
you agree with that as a possibility?
absolutely. I mean, we see this. I mean, obviously, that would be in their joint interests.
Yeah.
One suspects that there are people in Iran and Saudi Arabia who say to themselves, well, look, this quarrel we've had with each other, what advantage has it brought us? It's brought us nothing but trouble. In Iran, we have this constant problem with people on the periphery of our country. Do we really want problems with the Saudis? The Saudis also, I mean, rather than have to repress our Shia population all the time, might it not be better just to do some kind of a deal with the Iranians, and that would calm the whole thing down in Saudi Arabia itself? So one is sensing that people like that are thinking this, and of course they are bound to be thinking also beyond that. They will be saying to themselves, well, look, if we get together, Saudi Arabia and Iran, we are a tremendous force within the oil and energy markets. We're starting to see this happen, by the way, with other countries. So Putin comes along, tells Erdogan, well, I can't sell my gas directly to the Europeans anymore. Do you want to join me in a gas hub idea? And they say, what a brilliant idea, says Erdogan.
I thought that was brilliant.
Why not?
Putin, by the way.
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? But of course, it's happening on a bigger front too, because you see, we have the Kazakh leader, Tokayev, in Moscow. He comes along, and Putin says, well, look, we're major gas producers. Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan are the major gas producers. Why don't we all join forces? Why don't we create a gas OPEC? Let's create a gas union. Tokayev says, what a brilliant idea. Let's do it. Let's get in Uzbekistan involved. But of course, if you start doing that, you get Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan forming a gas union. Well, why not Qatar as well? After all, Qatar is a major gas producer. It's got very good relations with Moscow. Why shouldn't it participate in this as well? Why not Azerbaijan too? Why not Turkmenistan? Why not Algeria? I mean, everybody benefits, and you see all of this is happening.
I mean, that's the point I want to make. You see the diplomatic leadership of Russia. embodied by Lavrov. And so let's speak of Lavrov as a metonym for the entire Russian foreign policy establishment. Lavrov, what is he doing? He is making friends, and he is, doing the hard groundwork of making friends with all these different countries. And historically, Russia has always gone out of its way diplomatically, even when it was the Soviet Union, to try to be the honest broker between different countries in the global South, which historically has paid off huge dividends because people trust the Russians, because they go out of their way to keep that, to cement that trustworthiness. Whereas the Western leadership class, I mean, come on, Blinken is a midget compared to Lavrov. Lavrov, the man now I'm speaking of, not as the metonym. And the others, foreign policy people, Habeck, what's her name? The green woman.
Baerbock. Yeah.
She's an idiot. I'm sorry. I try rarely. I try to copy you. You are very judicious in your assessment of individuals, and I try to copy you in that regard. But in this particular case, I'm very sorry. I'm going to have to call a spade a spade. That woman is an idiot. They're fools, right? And you contrast that. And again, to go back to the point I'm trying to emphasize in this particular broadcast, the leadership class has no conception of what they are doing insofar as long-term goals, because you see Lavrov and the Russian foreign policy establishment, they have their aim. They have it. They're like pool hustlers lining up their shots, and they're not thinking about the ball that they're going to sink now. They're thinking 3 steps ahead, or if you want to use the chess metaphor, of course, famously, and so it seems to me that the Russians are simply outplaying the West.
Yes.
But my question becomes, of course, if you have this hysterical Western leadership class that can only double down, where do you think it ends? Because ultimately, that's the question.
That's a very good question. Now, can I just touch on what you've just said? Because, of course, the difference between Lavrov and the difference with Western diplomats like Baerbock, it comes back to what you said about understanding limits of power. So what happens if you are a global South leader is that Lavrov will come and you can have a conversation with him. You can have a discussion. You can have a dialogue. You may not always agree, and very often you don't, but you can actually have a discussion, and it'll be polite and courteous and whatever. If you have a meeting with Baerbock, what you're going to get is a lecture. And that is the fundamental difference.
Values,
exactly. And people don't like being lectured. I'll give an example, and it's a good example because a lot of people said to themselves, well, this is America trying to do diplomacy. The Biden administration, the Biden White House has now said, there's no question of any criminal action being taken against Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, because of the Khashoggi murder. And that is supposed to be an act of generosity to MBS. I wonder whether MBS sees it that way. I wonder whether MBS says to himself, who are the Americans to say whether I should be put on trial in any court or not? I mean, what business is this of theirs? Why do they think that they have the right to judge me in that kind of fashion? When I talk to the Russians, when I talk to the Chinese, this whole question never arises at all. I get patronized by the Americans. They don't take me seriously. They think that they can, give me these little things and I will raise oil production for them. When I speak to the Russians, when I speak to the Chinese, well, what we do instead is we talk about the oil market and the situation in the oil market, and we have intelligent and coherent conversations. So I think that's the difference. Western leaders are both won't accept limits on their own power, which they feel gives them the right to lecture. And of course, they feel that they have the moral right to lecture at one and the same time, as of course they take a very manipulative approach to international relations as they take with each other. So that instead of actually having serious discussions with somebody like MBS about the state of the oil market, for example. We have Biden coming along and saying, I want you to raise production to reduce oil prices because I need that, because that's important for me politically in America. So I mean, it's a very different thing. Where does this go? Where does this go? It's incredibly dangerous because we have a political class in the West which both won't recognize limits and at the same time is incompetent. That is a very dangerous combination indeed. And the most dangerous people, as we've both in our respective lives encountered, are people like that. People who won't accept that there's any acceptable limits on them, but at the same time but are fools at the same time.
Yeah. Well, the difference is that you and I, in our private lives, we might have met such people, but we knew that they didn't matter because they had no power. The problem here is that we have these fools, these patronizing, self-centered, egotistical fools, actually with their hands on the levers of power. That's why we're having this conversation, because in the private lives, you and I have both met blowhards who are fools, and we just ignore them, and they usually sort of like vanish on their own because, of course, everybody recognizes the same thing: either they change their attitude or they disappear. But this leadership class, my great concern is that the notion that they double down, that they keep on putting the crisis in a bigger box. Yeah. And my fear is that eventually they're going to burn down the whole house, i.e. do something irretrievable, something that cannot be taken back. And I don't want to get into the specifics, but I think that we're all adults enough to understand what I'm talking about. Because it seems to be, as your famous phrase, the direction of travel. It seems that that's the end goal of this thing, what I find horrifying, because they do not see. I mean, if you go up to the leadership class in the West and you ask them, at what point would you back off from this Ukraine situation? There is no point. They have made it abundantly clear that there will never be a point. The only thing that they keep on repeating ad nauseum is when Russia, is no longer in any of Ukraine, including Crimea, which is just not going to happen. I mean, it's like saying, the only time I'm going to negotiate with Mexico is when all the Mexicans are gone from Mexico. Not going to happen. What are you talking about? So, that's my great fear, that they're going to, like I said, using the metaphor again, putting the fire into a bigger box until in the end they're going to have to wind down. They're going to burn down the whole house. Do you think that we might get there? I mean, this is an honest question.
Absolutely, and it's entirely a valid question because, I mean, again, we're talking about the decline of the political class. Go back to the 1960s and consider the debates that were taking place in the United States at that time. And they weren't just serious. They were far more serious. I mean, people were arguing about Vietnam. They were arguing about the direction of the Cold War. And of course, the eventual decision was made. We pull out of Vietnam and we pursue détente because that's the logical, that's the correct way to go. That's the correct thing to do. That is looking very difficult to do in the West at the moment. And you're quite right, again, I think, to bring us back to Ukraine, because, of course, Ukraine, in a way, crystallizes this whole problem because things are not going the way it was expected or hoped that they might do. So going back to January, February, they were convinced. They convinced themselves Russian economy is a house of cards, which all we need to do is blow hard enough, pose a few sanctions, and the whole thing will come crashing down. Problem solved. It didn't work like that. Then they said to themselves, well, look, what we're going to do is we're going to defeat the Russians on the battlefield. We're going to give them all these weapons. We're going to move all these troops there. We're going to do all of these things. They're going to take back Kherson. We're going to drive them out of Kharkov. We're going to send them into headlong retreat. That will create a crisis in Moscow. And that will solve the problem. It hasn't happened. And what they're discovering is that they are locked into an indefinite war in which the Russians control the timetable, because they do. And you are starting to sense elements of panic floating around.
Oh yeah.
But there is no way in which anybody can come forward and say, we've got to end this thing. We got to negotiate. We got to talk to Erdogan and see whether he can put something together with Putin. We got to talk to Zelensky. We got to rethink the whole direction of our Ukrainian policy since, the Orange Revolution. And even before, we got to consider our role in NATO. They're not prepared to do that. So, of course, the risk is that what they're going to do instead is try and escalate. More troops on the ground, maybe. Other things which, as you correctly said, we shouldn't even really want to discuss, because there's a danger when we do discuss them that gives them some kind of reality. But that is the worry, that these people don't know how to stop.
Yeah, I think that the moment of panic, insofar as the Western leadership class is concerned, as far as to my way of thinking, was, I do believe it was around August or September, if you will, that all of a sudden this notion of a potential nuclear conflict, an escalation into a nuclear conflict, arose in, I want to say like August, September, something along those lines. Because before that, there was no talk of nukes at all. And my thinking, and all this nuclear talk came from the West. And my thinking was that was sort of like the moment of panic, because it was really the Western leadership class projecting onto Russia what they themselves are thinking. Because I've noticed too that the Western leadership class consistently projects onto their opponent what they themselves are thinking, and they say whatever, but it's always like this weird mirroring effect. And you were saying that before. You were saying that they are cynical and they assume that everybody else is cynical, which I agree. But there's this weird notion of projection, and so whenever they accuse their opponent of something, you know for a fact that they're thinking it. And in August, when they started talking about the possibility of nuclear confrontation or nuclear escalation, that's when I thought to myself, they're thinking about it. And retrospectively, at this point, just a few months later, I'm thinking to myself, that was the moment that they realized that this whole Ukraine thing is not going in the direction that they thought, because they truly believed. I mean, even Putin believed that the sanctions would ruin the Russian economy. Putin himself was shocked that it had, I mean, kudos to Elvira Nubolina, right? And the whole Russian central bank that has steered the Russian economy quite brilliantly. And of course, there must have been other factors as well that you and I at this moment might not be totally aware of, but that's besides the point. The point is the Russians didn't collapse. And the notion that the Russians are collapsing, I mean, Putin has 80+% approval rating in Russia itself, measured by think tanks that are not pro-Putin. So, he's got the country firmly in hand and firmly behind him in this whole process. It's really the West that is cracking. And
Yes.
So my thinking is that, all I see is them doubling down. And I'm really terrified. And I'm wondering, what could the Russians do? Because obviously the Russians must be thinking the same thing, or roughly along the same lines. What can the Russians do to prevent this apocalyptic escalation on the part of the West? It's a genuine question.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I think it's another factor which probably determines them to take it slow, in the sense that I think they probably say to themselves, look, if we put together a major strike force, perhaps we can take Kiev, perhaps we can push all the way to Volyn and close off the border, perhaps we can do all of that. But if we act in that way, that could precipitate a major crisis. The Western powers might find it very difficult to accept that if we go down that road. So we will achieve all of those objectives, but we will do it gradually. We will grind them down in Donbass. We will grind them down up to the eastern bank of the Dnieper. We will go on grinding them down beyond that. And hopefully, possibly, even as we keep our own powder dry, even as we keep our own nuclear and military forces ready, hopefully that will gradually mean that the reality of defeat in Ukraine becomes normalized, and it will give the Americans and the Europeans the option of just quietly putting Ukraine to one side, talking about it less, worrying about it less. It's already not so prominent in the newspapers as it once was. So I think that's one reason why the Russians prefer to take it slow.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my thinking too. Because back in April on Twitter, I wish I still had a Twitter account, but it got banned. Maybe this amnesty, I'll be allowed back on. But anyway,
Yeah.
back in
Well,
April, I said,
you should be, can I say?
"Oh, thank you."
Whether you want to be is another matter, but that's up to you.
Well,
But so you should
by
be.
the
I mean,
way,
the
parenthetically, just
banning people, the banning
on
was
the
just disgraceful.
yeah, it
Anyway,
was.
carry on.
But the thing is, see, frankly, it's kind of like a relief because it's such a time suck. You just get sucked into it. It's worse than a drug. But anyway, that's because you start saying, "Oh, I'll just be on for 5 minutes," and then an hour passes, and you're like, "What the hell happened?" But no, I said in April on Twitter, and I've said it on videos. I'm sure that the Russians, the big mistake that they could make is to have a Pearl Harbor moment, some sort of specific incident that sort of like lights a fire under the West. Gulf of Tonkin moment. I mean, I'm not talking about like a false flag. I'm talking about. I mean, they tried to do false flags repeatedly.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, certainly the Zaporozhye, certainly the notion of a dirty bomb. That was the thing. The issue insofar as the missile that hit Poland, the S-300 missile that was clearly fired by Zelensky regime. And by the way, an interesting tidbit: it turns out that it seems that it was aiming and missed a fertilizer depot in that little town. It would have blown the whole town sky high. Okay, so anyway, the point is, the worst thing I thought the worst thing that the Russians could do would be to have like a Pearl Harbor moment, some sudden strike that lit a fire under the West and provoked them into a major escalation. But yeah, it's looking at this point, but we'll have to see the winter offensive that's coming up. It's looking at this point as if the Russians have decided, look, we're going to keep on doing what we're going to be doing, what we have been doing rather, but just more troops. And we saw in Bakhmut how it's falling faster. I mean, the Bakhmut situation is rolling a little bit faster than before. And so it looks at this point, and let's keep our fingers crossed, because I think that a major, suppose the Russians launched a major offensive from the north, from Belarus, sweeping southward to Odessa and trying to cut the country in two. And at the same time, a couple of big offensives out of Volgorod and out of the Donbass. Then that would give the West a huge incentive to escalate, turn the dial all the way up to 10. And they could just create a wartime economy that they think that would solve all their economic problems, certainly solve their political problems, and unify the West into like this specific moment. And so I'm hoping that the Russians will continue with this slow grind. But I don't know. I mean, nobody knows.
We never know. But I mean, here I think we can be guided a bit by what the Russians themselves are saying. And I mean, we've had statements from senior Russians. We've had Surovikin, who's now the overall commander, and he said that he's not going to authorize big arrow offensives. He's going to grind the Ukrainians down. Those are the words he himself used. We had Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, saying, that he's, I hate the expression, but he said it, we're using Bakhmut as a meat grinder. That's what we're going to do. And I think, exactly as you said, they're going to do more of the same. What they've done is they've got many more troops there now. They've fortified the lines. It's going to make it more difficult for Ukraine to carry out successful offensives. But, they're working incrementally to dismantle Ukraine. And I think that they've prepared to take it slow and to take it long. And I think that on this issue, I think we can be confident that that's what the Russians are going to do, because that's what they're saying themselves. And that's what we're seeing on the battlefronts. So I don't personally think we're going to see some great advance all the way to Volyn to cut off the transport corridors. And by the way, I mean, I live in Britain, which, if you like, is perhaps the most fervid supporter of Ukraine amongst the big powers, the big Western powers. And I can say this straight away. What you're talking about, a Pearl Harbor moment, something that would light the fire. there are people in Britain who write in the media and in politics uh, who would welcome that.
Oh yeah.
They would
Oh yeah.
be. I mean, I read things that people say. I mean, there's I don't want to name them, but there's columnists in the newspapers who I am absolutely sure, if it looked as if Ukraine would fall tomorrow, they would
Hmm.
say we got to send our troops in. We got to act now to prevent that happening. It's our moral duty to do it, and they would have some support. That's what's so worrying about the situation. So I agree. Avoid a Pearl Harbor moment. Grind the Ukrainians down. And of course, as I've often said, and this isn't, I'm not a military person, as I say many times, but it is what I know from history. Long wars produce more decisive outcomes than short ones. Because a short war means the other side, they've kept most of their men there, things intact. Psychologically, they haven't been defeated in the same way. Whereas a long war means that the losing side realizes that there's just no coming back. The Confederacy, after 4 years, was never revived against the
Yeah.
Union in the United States. Germany, after the Second World War, has never been in a position to launch the kind of same operation again. So I think long wars tend to be more decisive, and I think the Russians understand that too.
So you're thinking that this offensive that the Russians are preparing, it's just going to be more of the same, just with more numbers, right?
More numbers. I mean, obviously there will be more objectives. So I
Right.
mean, they will take Bakhmut. They will probably clear Donbass.
Yeah.
I don't want to set their next
No,
targets,
I know. I don't. I
but
don't want to put
I
you
mean
on the spot
I'm not
there
I
in
don't have that.
speculation. Yeah.
If I had to guess, I'd say Zaporozhye, where the Ukrainians have been talking about launching their own offensive to the Black Sea. That might be a place that they would want to look at, but they don't expect to knock Ukraine out this winter. I don't think that is what the Russians are going to do, but economic pressure on Ukraine, more attacks on the energy system, making life more and more difficult for Ukrainians, more attacks on the front lines, grinding the Ukrainians down, as General Surovikin said, putting the West in a very difficult position where they don't really know what to do in response. There's all kinds of talk about, sending Patriot missiles and things like that. Pentagon isn't keen at all, apparently. But time plays, I think, to the advantage of the Russians,
Oh,
and of course
indisputably. Yeah.
they control the timetable. So I think
Yeah.
that is what they will do.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like that would be the smart move on a strategic grand plan kind of way. Just keep on grinding, and keep it not on the back burner, of course, but just keep it there at a simmer,
Yeah.
because the big spectacular. I think that the West wants that Pearl Harbor moment, and they're aching
Yes.
for it, and they've just been denied that moment. And as every day passes, the will of the West, certainly on a popular level, but even on a
Yes.
political level, starts to wane. And
Yes.
I'm wondering when that moment will be, when they just decide to give up the ghost. Because
that's
that's
a
what I'm hoping for. I'm
well. That's
hoping that the West will suddenly throw up its hands, or not. They don't even throw up their hands. They basically just quietly just turn away and pretend that it
yeah.
doesn't exist. It's in the background, and they don't see it anymore. Like they
Yes.
did with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with Libya, with every conflict, every chaos that they've started. Yeah, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, all I can say is this. I mean, again, I have to talk about Britain. I mean, back in February, March, April, every second house seemed to have a Ukrainian flag.
Yeah.
I mean, in Britain,
Hmm.
interest in this topic has ebbed. People are under severe economic pressure. They don't have the time to think about Ukraine anymore. And although those flags, most of them have disappeared. There's still a few. You still see them from place to place. But generally, people are more worried about other things. They're worried about their cost of living, how they're going to get through the winter. And this is a serious problem for many people now, how they're going to get through this particular winter. And again, Germany, which is the other country I know best, apparently the mood is the same. In Eastern Germany, there's now outright opposition, apparently, to continued support for Ukraine. In Western Germany, there's still quite a lot of support, but it's weakening. Now, the question is, how committed is the Western political class to this operation? How do they reverse course, given the difficulties they have reversing course? I don't know. I suspect what they will probably do is what you said. They'll just stop talking about it. And one day, a little bit like happened in Afghanistan, we'll hear that it's all stopped, that it's all ended. I think that's probably the best outcome we can hope for.
Yeah, that's the outcome that I'm hoping for. But that would mean that Ukraine, the Ukraine nation, will be ground down for at least another year. I mean,
absolutely. What has happened to Ukraine has been a tragedy, and Western policy towards Ukraine has been a crime. I was reading again an article somewhere. I think it was an American media article about an American official saying that, getting really exasperated by the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians are firing all these shells. The United States can't replace all of these shells. And he was saying, that the Ukrainians seem to have this idea that we have limitless abilities to supply them with shells, and we don't. And, it's time they understood that. Who led the Ukrainians to think that the West would support them? Who told the Ukrainians to keep fighting when there was a deal done almost there on the table back in March? Who's encouraged Ukraine to sabotage Minsk and turn its back always on peace? Well, you have to look to the West. It's the West that's done this. And now the West comes along and tells you, okay, well, sorry, we're out of shells. You've got to reduce the amount of shells you launch because we don't
which
have
is absurd.
anymore.
Yeah, it's
absurd.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, quick parentheses, to my Patreon supporters, the link has been posted. You can come on and ask questions, so long as you're brief and to the point, and we'd be happy to have you on the broadcast. So to the Patreon supporters, go check out the link. It's there now, live. Now, that's the thing. The Western leadership class led Ukraine as a nation, and certainly the Zelensky regime, up this garden path of limitless support. And that was just not possible. I mean, it's not even that they don't have the will. The West certainly has the will, but they just don't have the resources. And one of your broadcasts, you were talking about how Boeing was floating the idea of putting one of their random jet engines, behind like some explosive to have like a missile. That's just, blue skying nonsense. That's just, that's desperation. That's what it is. And the West, the United States, is buying shells from South Korea, 155 millimeter shells. They've run out. And here's the other thing that I find very amusing about this entire situation is that, let's not kid ourselves, the military intelligence services of the various countries, major players of the global South, China, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they see this. It's not just Brian Berletic who's counting up, how much stuff that they've used, right? And so they know that, oh my goodness, the Western great military of the United States, it's a paper tiger. It's a hollow shell. They are not going to have what it takes to carry out any kind of military intervention of any seriousness. I mean, it's they are achieving exactly what they never wanted to achieve, the exact opposite, what they wanted to inflict on the Russians. They wanted to show the Russians we're a hollow country that, a gas station with nukes, in the famous phrase, right? But it turned out that they are showing themselves to be a hollow nation. I mean,
absolutely,
that's just remarkable.
It is remarkable because, of course, what's happened is exactly what you said. I mean, the Russians have been shown to be a real country with real industries, a real military industrial complex, not just a money-making machine to be distributed amongst, the gilded oligarch class and members of the political class. One capable of producing weapons, getting men to fight, do all of those things. But the Western powers can't after just a few months, they're running out of shells. And they don't seem to have any idea of what to do, how to, they're scrabbling around the world trying to find more shells. They're trying to apparently they're trying to find old Soviet shells left over from the Cold War in places like Libya now. I mean, it is ludicrous. And it is the emperor has no clothes. And this is suddenly, and this is going to be a massive moment of revelation. This is different, by the way, from Vietnam. Nobody after Vietnam had any doubts that the United States remained a mighty military, technological, and industrial power. Nobody said, I mean, I can remember, when the people were evacuated from the embassy, nobody said at that time that the United States has run out of 155 millimeter shells.
No, no. But now they are.
Today, it seemed that they are. So coming back to your original point, people who believe that their power has no limit, are now discovering that yes, it does. Very difficult for them to internalize, but very apparent to the rest of the world. And going back to that G20 summit in Bali, you could see that the rest of the world is looking at all of this, and they say to themselves, these people, these Western leaders who strutted and strutted around the world stage for so long, they're actually hollow.
Yeah. Let's bring on our first.
How you doing? Can you hear me?
Curb Stomp, how's it going? Yeah.
Curb Stomp. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Clearly.
No, I think he's having some tech issues. Curb Stomp. Yeah. Come back and I'll bring you on. Let me bring the next guest. Rob, how's it going? Are you there?
I'm here. Let me put in some headphones.
Okay, then if you're not 100%, okay, go ahead.
My question to Alex is, do you see Russia helping Hungary and Serbia in the future?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, they will help Hungary economically. They will try and keep oil and gas flowing to Hungary because it's good for them. I mean, it's not just that Hungary is a friend and is a nuisance within the European Union, but it's also a way of the Russians showing to Hungary and to other countries, if you are good, if you're faithful to us, we are faithful to you. Now, Serbia, it's even more that, because if you have any dealings with Russians, as I have done, you will know that Russians care about Serbia. It's a Slav country, an Orthodox country. It's a country with which many, many Russians have very strong feelings about. And I think that it is inconceivable that any Russian leader could simply turn his back on Serbia. And I think they will do whatever they can within the limits of their power. Always remember that, to help Serbia.
Alexander, I wanted to ask you a quick question. Why this weird connection, this so tight connection with Serbia, between Russia and Serbia? I mean, there are several countries in between them. I've never quite understood that. Do you happen to know the background on that?
It's an evolving thing. It evolved significantly after these areas began to gain independence. The Balkan states began to gain their independence, largely, by the way, as a result of Russian action in the 19th century. So Serbia is an Orthodox country. It's a Slav country. Mm-hmm. It's also been one which has been loyal, as the Russians would see it, to Russia. Mm-hmm. So if you talk about Bulgaria, for example, Bulgaria has worked with Germany on occasions. I mean, it sided with the Germans in the Second World War, whereas the Serbs have always been friends with Russia. And the Russians are very aware of that. And if you're talking about Montenegro, which was for a long time connected to Serbia, there was intermarriage between the Montenegrin royal family, for example, and the imperial family in Russia. So these are very old connections going all the way back to the 19th century. They are there in Russian literature. I mean, Vronsky, Anna Karenina's lover, at the end of the novel, he goes off to Serbia to fight to liberate the Serbs from the Ottomans. It's one of the last things that happens in the novel. So it's very deep. It goes a long way. They understand each other. They can follow each other's languages to a great extent. and they do have this very strong connection and feeling of friendship for each other.
Rob, does that answer your question? Great. Thank you so much for being on. You take care, Rob. Thanks for the support. Curb Stomp, how's it going? Are you there? Uh-oh, Curb Stomp's thing has an issue. Let's bring in JJ. JJ, how's it going?
It's going very well, thank you. My question is about the sort of internal stability of the West. We've seen, for example, in the Netherlands, the revolt of the farmers over the whole COVID restrictions. We've seen lots of revolts, like in sort of Canada, you know, the truckers and everything. And of course, we've had also internal differences, such as, if you remember back last year, I think it was, with the French military actually sent a letter to Macron saying, oh, there's a problem with Islamism, we need to deal with it. And there was a big hoo-ha over that. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on the sort of internal stability of Western nations.
Right. Well, I think there's two things to say. First of all, the political class in the Western nations is very stable. The people of the Western nations are, by contrast, becoming extremely discontented. And this is the potential crisis that is to come, because that discontent, because the political class is stable and united, that discontent is not finding expression within the political system. So whereas previously in democracies in the West, and you know, I don't want to idealize the democracies we used to have in the West, but there were mechanisms through the political process to allow grievances to be aired, people to discuss these things, discontents to be, you know, remedied and articulated. That is going. So on the one hand, it's likely that we will continue on our present course for quite a long time, simply because it's very difficult to challenge this political system, this political class, which is such tight control, and which I expect to do exactly what Gonzalo was saying, try to tighten its control even more through authoritarian methods. He said that earlier in the program, and I want to just say I completely agree with him about that. But of course, what is happening is that the seething discontent and the problems below are intensifying. And at some point, this pressure cooker is going to blow. And that's when we are going to discover that this is not a formula for stability. It's a formula for systems collapse. And that is what I worry about. I mean, I'm a person who lives in the West. I live in Britain. I don't want to see that happen. Systems collapse is a horrible thing, but I'm afraid that's the direction in which we're going.
Yeah, because also you have to think to yourself that the leadership class, however incompetent they may be, they are actually running things, but there is no class of people who could replace them. So if they go up in smoke somehow, you know, who's going to run the ship? Who's going to run the typical bureaucracies that you need to have running and all the rest of it? So yeah, JJ, anything else on your mind?
No, I think that's about it.
Well, thank you so much for your support.
JJ.
All right, bye.
Take care. Maggie, how's it going?
Hi guys. It's so strange. I feel like I know you because I've been listening to you for so long now. My question.
Thank you so much. It's
You're
greatly
welcome,
appreciated.
And fair play to you. Not easy in Ukraine. I was very touched by your talk the other day, that short one you did.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So, Alexander, what about the British Isles? I'm in Southern Ireland. We've got Northern Ireland, part of the EU, part of the UK, a complete fudge. How do you see the British Isles panning out, say, over the next 5 years? Particularly if the EU disintegrates, which I think there's a chance of.
I think there's a high chance of. Well, I will say this. I was in the north of Ireland. I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly.
Yes.
Some years ago, and I visited places there. I spoke to lots of people. My own feeling about this is that Irish unity is now a certainty, and that it is going to happen relatively soon. And I think that is going that.
In what context? Sorry to interrupt. In what context, Alexander?
Let me explain.
We're so pro EU here, except for
I
me.
know you are. Absolutely. I know. I understand that. But I think what is happening is that is the direction of travel in Ireland.
Yes, I agree.
And what you are seeing in England, which has been the country, if I could call it that, the nation that's held the United Kingdom together, is a very profound hollowing out. So people in England are not interested in holding on to the north of Ireland anymore. I mean, that kind of unionism has gone. I think there's general sense of exhaustion. There's a profound sense of malaise. Yeah. Now, I have to say, Scotland is a complicated story, because I think my own personal view is that the current government in Scotland, the Scottish Nationalist Party there, is very, very happy with the existing situation. They're in control. They can pretend that they're nationalists. At the same time, they get an awful lot of help from the London government, which basically has cut a kind of de facto deal with them. So they talk about independence. They don't move towards independence. The English, the British government, the London government is happy to just leave things as they are. But again, if there is a crisis in Scotland, if there is a real push for independence in Scotland, I don't think England is in a position any longer where it's going to resist it. I don't think that's the mood in England at all. I think people here feel very exhausted, very knocked down. And I think that a disintegration of that kind, that could very well happen. I mean, Scotland, the north of Ireland, Irish Union, all of these sort of things. Now, the question to my mind is, when we talk about the decline of Britain, we need to talk about the decline of England, which is real. If you go around the English regions, you can see it. And the question then is, will the disintegration of the British Union, will that help England find its way? Will it recover, or will it accelerate its decline? I don't have the answer to that question. I simply don't know. I think we are going to see the breakup in the United Kingdom. Certainly, as I said, the north of Ireland is going to leave. Scotland, at some point, I expect, will leave too. What will happen in England, the core territory, if you like, that is the big unanswered question. And I'll say this, we are a very law-abiding people in England, as is famously said. We're very loyal, have been very loyal to our institutions. I think there is a degree of anger building up in England, which the political class in London underestimates. And I would not depend on that loyalty, that stability, as being something that can be extended indefinitely.
And not before time, Alexander, that anger, not before time.
Oh, well, indeed, absolutely so. Yeah. I think that is true. I mean, I say something else quickly and very briefly, which is that I think one of the things people don't realize is the great anger in working class communities towards the Labour Party. There is this huge sense that the Labour Party, which was the party which was created by workers through their unions to represent them, has completely abandoned them. And I think that this is a seething anger which is there and which is also growing.
Well, will Farage step in to that gap? And that's my last question, Gonzalo. I don't want to take up too much.
Yeah, he's now indicated. He wrote a piece in the Daily Telegraph in which he basically said that he's re-entering politics, and he pointed out that Reform UK, the party he created, it could be polling up to 39% in the polls and all of that. I think he has a long way to go, to be honest. I'm not sure he will ever reach the end point either. And to be frank, I have to say, I think Farage himself is looking increasingly like yesterday's man. He
Well,
was
he's
at
looking
his
wrecked.
best.
He's looking wrecked, Alexander. He's
He
not
looking
looking.
wrecked.
He's not
Exactly.
looking present and confident.
Exactly. I agree. I completely agree. So I don't think we should look to Farage as the solution to the problems here. I don't know where that solution is going to come from. And that is, of course, my big worry. I mean, there isn't a political force in Britain at the moment which is able to take all this feeling of seething anger and discontent that exists there and turn it round and find a way forward and give a vision which not Britain perhaps, but the people of England could combine and follow behind. I just don't see that. And that is my great worry.
Yeah, mine too. A lot of family there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You take care. And thank you very much for your support.
You're welcome. Bye.
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 Gary W., how's it going?
Very well, thank you. Great to speak to you. You guys both do a great job. So I just want to ask Gonzalo, how are you eating and keeping yourself warm, and what are you using for money?
Just grivna, because that's the medium of exchange, and there are exchange houses that will cash in your what we call it, your dollars or euros or whatever currency you have. And the supermarkets have food. I mean, I was listening to Alexander, and the thing that I wanted to point out, because the reason he was mentioning about the egg situation and the poultry situation in the UK was he was asking me how's the food situation in Ukraine. And in the supermarkets, there is food. And it was a little bit shocking. I noticed this a few weeks ago. I haven't paid attention since, but there were Chilean grapes. I felt very represented in the halls of the supermarket there. There is food, there is heating, but of course, when the lights go out, that's when the heating goes off. And when the lights go out, you're going to have roughly 12 to 15 hours of okay temperature. But after that, it starts getting very cold very quickly. And it's inevitable because the heating system depends on electricity, even though it's a separate system. But the system that distributes the heat to the various homes is electrical, of course, and so that is a great concern of mine at this point. But as far as I'm concerned, I've already cast my die, if you will. I've already decided that I'm going to stay here and see this through till the end. For two reasons. Number one, I want to see what happens, and number two, I happen to have this privileged position of being okay for money and my particular material circumstances, and I have all this time, and so I'm writing very diligently a series of essays that I'll soon enough be publishing for free, because I'm much more interested in getting people's opinion as to own a few dimes off of them. But that's basically my routine. Is I'm writing from 9 to 5, literally. And then catching up on the news and posting videos. As of late, I've been a little bit remiss on that front. I'm hoping to bring it back online insofar as that's concerned. But the situation here in Kharkov, in the area where I am, is very, very quiet. But there are people about. There are a few shops and restaurants open, and the supermarkets are all open. And so it's sort of like a frozen city, if you will. It's just waiting. Do keep in mind that Kharkov is traditionally, historically Russian. The majority of the population here are ethnic Russians, and everybody speaks Russian. The ethnic Ukrainians, they left the city. I would estimate, of course, this is a guesstimation on my part, but I would guesstimate that maybe 40% of the population has fled and will probably not return. But the people who remained, they are Russian, and so they would not have any kind of problem with the city being taken over by the Russians at some point, which I believe will eventually happen. I'm not saying that it's what I want or not want. I'm saying that as a practical matter, just looking at it objectively, I think that in 5 years' time, Kharkov will be a Russian city. And I don't think that there's any way to stop that, just as I believe that Odessa will be a Russian city. And Alexander, I think that You would agree with that assessment?
Absolutely, completely. I entirely that view. I think that is definitely where we're going to end.
Will the cold weather win the war? Will General Winter win the war?
That's a good question, Alexander. What do you think?
Well, I think General Winter is playing an ever increasing role. The thing to understand about General Winter, and he's played big roles in many wars that the Russians have fought, is that he's been useful, but he's not been the decisive general. That tends to be the Russian army. So yes, General Winter will play a big role, but it'll be the Russian army that does it in the end.
Gary, thank you so much. Oh, please go ahead.
Last one. I'll go.
No.
Is Gonzalo, is your food and possibly some of your heat coming from Russia?
That's a good question. I don't know, to tell you the truth. I honestly do not know. I would assume not. All right. But I don't actually know, to tell you the truth. Certainly not the electricity, because there are areas of the city that are without electricity, and it is becoming a humanitarian crisis. And that is something that I don't believe that the Western media is reporting on any level. But it gets to a certain point where you cannot live in this environment. I mean, it's just not possible. Okay, there is a limit to how many hoodies and jackets and coats you can put on to yourself before you just become a ball of wool and you're still freezing. So it is inevitable that the West is going to suffer another humanitarian crisis as the winter becomes worse and people, by whatever means possible, flee to the West. Mayor Klitschko, Alexander, I believe you can confirm this, he basically told people to evacuate Kiev, that the Kiev, the administrative entity of the city of Kiev would not be able to care for them. So, I mean, if I were living in Kiev, I'd flee. But insofar as Kharkov is concerned, like I said, it's sort of like trundling along, and we'll see how it goes. You know, I mean, I myself am fairly well prepared, and so I'm concerned, certainly, but I'm looking at it realistically, and so that's why I've decided to say.
Good, thank you. Goodbye.
Hey, by the way, Gary, I've never seen you on one of the Sunday Patreon live streams. I hope I see you next time. Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay,
and I want to bring somebody on who's very special, Susie Q, who is one of the moderators and a supporter on Patreon. Thank you so much, Susie, for coming on.
Well, I'm glad to see you, and I'm so excited to see Alexander here. I'm a great fan of the Duran, and having you here together with one of my other faves, Gonzalo, is just a real pleasure. So
I'm one of your other favorites. I'm not the favorite. Come on, come on. You're cheating on me with Alexander. That's no fair. What about me? Aren't I handsome enough?
You are very, very handsome. Absolutely. And some of the advice that you give to young men, I'm going to use that with my young adult boys. So
thank you very
because
much.
It's excellent, really excellent.
So please,
so
what's on your mind?
So I have a couple of questions. I foresee in the future very soon that the whole NATO alliance is going to collapse because obviously they're going to lose. They're going to lose. Stoltenberg said, "Hey, if Ukraine loses, this is a devastating for NATO." But what about the European Union? Because it's got to be increasingly clear that they do not have the individual countries' best interest at heart. So what do you think about that?
The two go together. I think the way to understand it is, bear in mind, both are headquartered in the same city, which is Brussels. So, I mean, NATO and the EU have become so closely connected to each other that if the one falls, the other is going to fall with it. Now, that wasn't always the case. I can remember a time, back in the 70s, early 80s, when people talked about the EU or the European Economic Community, as it still was, as something distinct from NATO and even separate and even rivalrous to NATO in some ways. But today, you look at the people who run them, they're basically the same people. The ideas are the same. The way they operate is very interconnected. EU laws often refer to NATO now. So if NATO collapses, with it collapses the whole European structure that we have become so accustomed to, and the EU itself becomes unviable.
Yeah,
I also wanted to ask you
that's
about
my thinking. I'm sorry, I just want to point out that's exactly my thinking as well, that the two have become so intertwined that the loss of one will become the ruin of the other. At first I wasn't quite clear as to why Stoltenberg was saying that if Ukraine loses, NATO loses. But I think now that, how could I put it? I think that Stoltenberg said that to emphasize the commitment of NATO, but it's becoming actually a prophecy insofar as NATO is concerned, because if Ukraine falls, then NATO, people will say, well, what's the point of this particular alliance? I don't know if you would agree with that, Alexander.
I absolutely do. I think, by the way, there will come a day when Stoltenberg will bitterly regret having said that. I think he will feel that he made a huge error saying this. But in fact, ultimately, there is a truth to this, because all those countries on the eastern flank of NATO, some of which have never been entirely keen on NATO, by the way. I mean, if you visit, my wife was just recently in Prague, for example, there's much more doubts about NATO and its utility than I think you probably read and hear. But anyway, the point is, people have seen all this support that has been given to Ukraine. They've seen the war that was fought there. If the West loses in Ukraine, they will inevitably say, well, if they weren't prepared, they weren't able to win in Ukraine against the Russians, how can we be sure that if we find ourselves in a confrontation with, they'll come and rescue us from the Russians?
If they come,
how can they do it? And would it be better if, rather than stick with NATO, get ourselves into this constant confrontation with the Russians, when we can't rely on the NATO guarantee, might it not be better if instead we start talking to the other side, with which historically we've had good relations, and find some way getting out of NATO and becoming friends or neutrals again in a way that protects our security far better? So I think this is an important conflict in that respect. And I think that, Vietnam was far away. It didn't really matter whether South Vietnam fell or not. Afghanistan, far away. Didn't, most people get it, didn't matter. Ukraine is different because it is a European country, because it borders on NATO itself. If the war in Ukraine ends in a clear-cut defeat, as I am sure it will, then it is going to be a crisis for NATO, and nobody should be in any doubt about it.
Yeah. I have some concerns about Austria. All of my aunts, uncles, cousins, they're all in Austria, and I'm, of course, very worried about them. They're very, they all went through my uncles and aunts all went through the war as children. I'm very concerned about them. They're not a part of NATO, but obviously a part of the EU. And I'm hearing in the area of Styria, which is in the south, that astronomical bills for electricity have gone on. They basically are firing people. Businesses are going out.
This is true. This is the pattern right across Europe. And by the way, I mean, you get all kinds of attempts to manipulate the inflation numbers. So we've had inflation numbers that tell us that inflation is falling in Europe, but of course it's not translating into the actual bills that people are paying. So we have all of this, and that by the way annoys people when they're told about how things are getting better when in fact they're getting worse. But anyway, coming to Austria is a very good example of the point we were just making, because of course the Austria, which has, by the way, a long tradition of diplomacy. I mean, it was an empire once upon a time, but with its with the self-confidence, exactly, the self-confidence that comes with that. And as you correctly say, it's a country that's stuck to its neutrality. It's not let itself get drawn into NATO. Well, my understanding is that Austria, there is a strong feeling in Austria that this has gone wrong, that this whole Ukraine thing has been a disastrous mistake, a hideous debacle, And the political forces that are trying to gain strength in Austria are apparently increasingly articulating that view. And if there is a clear-cut defeat for the West in Ukraine, a region close to Austria, with which the Austrians have had historic ties, Galicia in the West was a province of the Habsburg Empire. I think Austria is one of those first countries that is going to start saying to itself, well, maybe we should start moving away from this Western system and start to rethink our relations with the other side. By the way, I've been to Vienna. I think Vienna is one of the most amazing cities. And I will say this.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
one of the things about Vienna is, and it's so interesting to compare Vienna with, say, Munich, which isn't so far away in some ways, is that Vienna clearly looks eastward in a way that Munich doesn't. So that they're more aware of this. They have a more international outlook than you'll find in some other parts of Europe.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite city. I love Vienna, and I've spent summers when I was a kid in Austria, and I miss it. I'd love to go back, but obviously I can't travel because I didn't take the medicine, so I'm stuck here. Do you think there's any chance that at some point, especially with this recent, and I think even the New York Times covered it, these war crimes, these executions of Russian soldiers, that the West might go, this might be our out. Let's throw Zelensky under the bus.
I think that something really horrible and gruesome would have to happen for that to happen.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, because let's be frank about it, gruesome things are happening every day. Somebody in the West might decide that, this is a way, this is perhaps, following from what you said, this is something, we can come to the Ukrainians and say, this has gone far enough. We can't go on supporting you anymore because you're behaving in this appalling fashion. It will be an extremely difficult thing to explain to people in the West now. If Rishi Sunak were to come along and say to the British people, after all these months of telling us, what heroic, gallant, courageous people these Ukrainians are, that there are people who commit war crimes and who have horrible ideologies. I mean, the sense of shock and the sense of betrayal that many people in Britain would feel, I mean, it just cannot be imagined. I mean, the media would, its credibility would collapse as well. And I'm afraid that works against that happening. When you tell such a big lie, you're stuck with it, basically.
Yeah, my thinking has been that the only way they could possibly abandon the Zelensky regime is if he were assassinated. And I've always thought to myself that might be the trump card that the West has. And I can't believe I'm saying that, but after the sabotage of Nord Stream, the West is clearly capable of anything. The United States is capable of anything. And if they calculate that, physically getting rid of Zelensky, and saying, "Oh, he's gone. Oh, such a tragedy," and let's turn this around and make nice with the Russians. I mean, I think that would be the only possibility, quite frankly. But
when I said throw him under the bus, I meant that realistically or figuratively. So, anyways, I best go because my husband's knocking on my door here.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. And Susie,
thank you so much again. All right. You take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
I hope so. Bye-bye.
Okay. So, we don't have any more questions for the time being. But I just wanted to add something that I'd forgotten to mention about the European Union. The European Union itself seems to me like the embodiment of this cosmopolitan leadership class. And with this note, I want to wind down our live stream, which has been, as always, a delight with you. But the European Commission, they are unelected bureaucrats that have essentially absolute control over the continent. And of course, over this period of time, starting in February of 2020 with the pandemic, they have increased their power tremendously And they seem to embody this leadership class, this authoritarian leadership class that is beholden to this bizarre grab bag of virtues, quote unquote, that, by the way, don't have any kind of logical consistency or moral consistency whatsoever. And so, what do you think of that?
No, that's absolutely that is absolutely true. I mean, the political class in the West has, as you said at the start of the program, it's detached itself from the nations, and it's in some ways, especially in Europe, the European Commission is its logical, its obvious gathering point. They feel much more kinship and loyalty to each other than they do to their respective nations. By the way, I mean, I visited the European, I mean, it's some time since I've been there, but I mean, it's a long time since I've been there. But I mean, even when I was going there in the 80s and 90s, I could see that this attitude existed. If you were an Italian and you worked in the European Commission and you continued to think of yourself as an Italian, well, that was problematic. You had to think yourself as a European. You had to be. You had to embrace exactly this whole and of course there is a unifying. I'm not ideologies almost to dignify it because it's not very. It's not like Marxism, you know.
It's not coherent. It's not coherent at all.
Exactly. Yeah. But there is a kind of unifying outlook which does bind them together. And by the way, which makes them incredibly intolerant to anybody who's outside their sort of circle and who doesn't share this kind of mindset that they have. And it's absolutely correct.
We have Reckless Abandon, who is one of your moderators, and he's become one of my moderators and one of my supporters on Patreon. Brett, how's it going, my friend? Good to see you.
Oh, not bad. Very good. Be the first time I ever talked to Alexander in person too.
Which is a great honor and privilege and joy to see you at last.
Yes, I always miss your live streams about 4 o'clock in the morning. So
hardy man. Yeah. What's on your mind, my friend?
I would like to ask Alexander about the controversy about the legal team of Julian Assange. I mean, Lucy Commissar's looked up, gone through it all, and said found all these various links to the British deep state, that whole law firm, like Jeffrey Robinson's support for Bill Browder, Jennifer Robinson's working with Bellingcat in Syria, all this sort of thing. Now, that's very, very, it's almost like that. He's been spied on the whole time by his lawyers. Yeah. And it explained a lot of things.
it might explain quite a few things. I have to say, the whole Julian Assange case has filled me with deep horror, and I will. I mean, nothing any longer will surprise me. If you're telling me that some of his lawyers are actually working for the other side, it wouldn't surprise me. And I will also say this, sometimes I've seen legal arguments made, which I didn't think were terribly strong. I've heard things put across, which I didn't think were going to really work. So, that might be explanations for this. But ultimately, the real horror about this case for me, as somebody who lives in Britain, has been to see how the British courts have handled it. And the conduct, the treatment of Assange over both the earlier extradition case to Sweden, which was a nonsensical case, and over the appeal that he made, that was made by the Americans to this decision by the district judge who refused the extradition, to the United States. I mean, it profoundly shocked me. Now, the earlier case, the one about the Swedish case,
it was absurd. It was absurd.
It's difficult to explain this because you read the judgment and it had all the appearance of a logical judgment. If you know how the law works, it just didn't make any kind of sense at all. It's like, you see a chessboard. If you're a chess player and you know that there are certain moves that are illegal moves, and somebody who isn't a chess player might not know that. Well, that is exactly how that judgment was. And I mean, what made it particularly absurd is that the case was fought, that Assange's lawyers fought it on a certain interpretation of the law, extradition law, which everybody accepted as correct. The High Court said, actually, it's wrong. We're going to change this. We're going to go against that. I'm not going to even go into the details of this. And then Parliament, just a short time afterwards, changed the law to bring it back to what we all thought it was before the High Court made that decision.
So they made this one exception just to nail Assange?
Exactly. And the other thing was with the latest case, which involved the High Court again and the Court of Appeal, about the Americans suddenly out of the blue offer these assurances that if Assange is sent to America, he won't be put in a special prison, he might be sent to Australia, all those kind of things. And the High Court discusses all of this at the back end of an appeal. And they say, well, we're not going to even look at these things because, of course, the United States, we have to accept what they say. Now, assurances like this, and I've done extradition work, I know how it works. When extradition work, when a country offers assurances, there are weeks of discussion in the courts about these assurances. You go through each one, you examine them in detail, you look at the authorities, you look at what the record of the country that's offering those assurances is. You don't just accept them on the back end of an appeal. It doesn't happen. So I'm not going to defend the lawyers. I'm not going to say Assange's lawyers have done a wonderful task for him, because actually I do have criticisms of the lawyers. I hope what you say about some of them, possibly having these deep state connections and having perhaps spied on them, I hope that's not true, but I don't know whether it is true or not. What I do know is that the behavior of the courts has been incredible, unbelievably depressing, extraordinarily concerning. And as a British person, I'm very ashamed of it.
You're talking basically about a cynical manipulation of the law by the courts. Like we were saying before, about how the leadership class would cynically manipulate anything in order to get a disadvantage. That is deeply depressing if it's in the justice system.
Absolutely. Now, bear in mind, of course, that the justice system in Britain has always held itself out as being independent, as being the last line of defense. I've worked with judges. I've had very high opinions of judges. I've felt that many of them really did believe and internalize these feelings. So I have a certain personal sense of betrayal over this, which I'm perhaps expressing myself rather over emotionally because of it.
I would completely agree. Brett, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, weren't there strange selections of judges as well?
Very.
Very.
Again, if we go to the appeal again, the latest appeal, what we had was a situation where the district judge made a decision. I disagree with 90% of it, but she said she shouldn't be extradited because if he goes to the United States, the conditions he'll be placed in are terrible. So the United States brings in an appeal, and the judge, the High Court judge, the first High Court judge to look at this appeal, grants permission on very limited grounds. He says there's one or two things that the US is raising which are reasonable enough, but they're not to be allowed to bring up other issues calling into question the reliability of the defense's witnesses. And then out of nowhere, a new judge is parachuted in, and he says, well, actually, the United States should be allowed permission to appeal on every ground, and they have every right to challenge the defence's witnesses, even though that was clearly wrong. And then in this terrible decision that we've just talked about, the one where they decided to accept the assurances in this terrible way, as I said, at the back end of a two-day hearing. Two-day hearing was far too short. But, in the last half hour, they suddenly turn and accept assurances, which 3 weeks of hearings would have been needed to examine properly. Anyway, they hear this and they say, well, actually, the first judge was right after all. We can't actually challenge the defense's witnesses, even though it's the same judge who overruled the first judge. He's there still. And, you say to yourself, well, what is going on here? You admit that the first judge was right, and then you take the case away from him, and you insert yourself into this hearing in this way, and then you have a hearing conducted in this bizarre fashion. As I said, things which I never expected in my life to see have actually happened. So coming back to your original point, if there were people amongst his legal team who were not faithful to him and violated the fundamental principles of what lawyers should be, well, I'm sorry to say this, and I say this with a very heavy heart, I would be surprised.
Well, you might think the lawyers appeal some of those things, wouldn't they?
Well, they've tried to. They've tried to, but it's not been easy because the way in which the procedures in Britain work are so complicated that, that's the other thing. Kafka, if Kafka was writing a book, he would say this is impossible. It goes beyond even the worst things that I could imagine. It really is. He can only appeal the last High Court decision when the High Court has heard another appeal that he's bringing against the district judge, which will extend this thing perhaps another 2-3 years. And remember, this wretched man, this unfortunate, this tragic man, is in Belmarsh all that time.
Yeah, incredible. Brett, thank you so much for coming. Anything else on your mind?
No, that's all. Yep, thanks. Good to see both of you.
And thank you for all your hard work, which is very appreciated.
No problem. Thanks.
Brett, thank you. You take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Oh, wait. Matt's Ollie Matts, who was supposed to be the next one, he disappeared, which is a shame. I was going to bring him up. So maybe Matt's is going to be there, and we'll see. But anyway, look, we've gone a little over 2 hours. I think that this has been a pretty good broadcast. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, I'm going to say this: the Ukraine crisis is a catalyst. We've been talking about the incompetence of the Western political class. They engineered this crisis, and it's exposed starkly their own inadequacy, their own lack of understanding of the world, their own incredibly bad judgment. It's going to accelerate their eventual fall. And
Alexander, I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you. I'm so sorry. I just want to ask you something, because this is my belief. There are a lot of people who say that all of this is part of a plan. That this is part of a notion of bringing down the West for the plans of the 2030 plan or the World Economic Forum and whatnot. I personally do not believe that it is some controlled demolition for the benefit of some hidden forces or dark figure somewhere. I think it's a simple and blatant incompetence of a leadership class that is completely detached from reality, let alone the people of the country that they're supposed to represent. And my opinion is that it's not a big conspiracy. It's not part of a plan. It's just stupidity. That's always been my belief on this situation. Do you hold similar beliefs?
I hold the same views as you. I'm going to just add something else. It's a point I've made many times. If there are people in the political class who think that a controlled demolition of the entire system of the West is going to work in their own interests, then they are even greater idiots than I take them for. Because it isn't. They're destroying the very eco-culture in which they function But no, I don't think so. I mean, bear in mind, I've met some of these people. I mean, as I said, I've been to the European Commission. Exactly, and I mean, they're not
bright.
They're not complicated. Yeah, exactly, in that kind of a way. They don't have that. I mean, they're not thinking in that sort of a way. Yes, I mean, there's all sorts of, no doubt. I mean, they're very good at intrigue and manipulation and all of this. But basically, and I think this is the point to understand, they like things as they are. They don't need a demolition because they're on top. So why demolish that which you already control?
Exactly. Very, very well said. Yeah. Because I have to admit, I personally become extremely irritated when I hear these notions of a controlled demolition, that it's all part of some Agenda 21 or 2030 or whatever agenda. I just get impatient with it because, I mean, they're on top, as you say. Why would they bother to blow it up if they're on top? But it makes a lot more sense to see all these decisions and say, oh, they're just stupid. And the thing is, you and I have both met people of, big names, and some of them very, very powerful. And one of the things that shocked me, and I remember in my very late 20s, early 30s, to be meeting such individuals, they're not very bright. They're very intelligent. I mean, in the sense of like knowing multiple languages and being very clever and very glib, very easy with the verbiage. But they're not particularly smart. They certainly aren't particularly insightful, and they certainly do not have some sort of overarching view of the world and where the world ought to go to. Yeah. It's more like they're constantly improvising with whatever they have at hand. That's been my experience. And what about yourself?
It's been exactly my experience as well. People, and I'm afraid people who are the beneficiaries of it, always confuse an expensive education with intelligence. Yeah. The two do not always match. In fact, more often than not, they don't. An expensive education can conceal profound stupidity. So you can speak multiple languages, you can quote Shakespeare, you can do all kinds of things of that kind.
Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, all of them. They've all had very expensive educations in their different ways. So have the Bushes, the Bidens, all of these people.
Yeah.
But
just because Boris Johnson can quote classical Greek doesn't mean that he's particularly bright or is making smart decisions.
Exactly. And beyond that, the other thing is, when you look at their political speeches and the way they speak, it's nearly always cliches. I mean, I was looking at Sunak's latest speech to the City of London, the one that he gave a few days ago. It was just one string of cliches after another. So you don't really need to be very bright to internalize that kind of language. And the trouble is, when you meet these people, what you very quickly discover is that they don't just speak in cliches, they think in cliches.
And by the way, I know I'm drawing out this broadcast, but it's such a pleasure to talk to you as always. One of the things that is so shocking to me is to read the cliche-ridden nonsense of these political figures in the West, and then read a speech by Putin, by Lavrov, by Xi. They are intelligent. They have, they're on the ball. And so it's just such a delight and pleasure to read these figures that I mentioned and contrast them with the Western leadership speeches, and it's so depressing. And by the way, Mats Ollie has been patiently waiting. Mats, are you there? Mats, hi, how are you? You're the last one today, so get in your question while you can. How's it going? Are you there? It might be better if you turn off your video. It might be better for the audio. But go ahead. Are you there? Hello? Hello? Oh,
no sound.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead. Okay. Well, we'll have to. I think that there's Mats. Are you there? Hello?
I can see you. Perhaps if you switch off the video,
yes,
we might be able to get
I am.
Well done.
Hello, Mats.
Hello, Mats.
So I don't know. I have some internet.
Okay, well, yeah, I think next time.
If you can hear me, I'm very, very glad that are doing that makes life bearable. So I thank you so much.
So what's on your mind?
I don't have a functional sound yet. I'm gonna try another headset.
Okay,
here.
then we'll have to set you for later. Turn off the video, Mats. That might be the best, but actually, unfortunately, we're winding it down, and I feel very bad, Mats, because you've been waiting very patiently there. I've seen in the green room. Turn off your video, Mats, if you can hear me, because I think that the video is interfering with your signal.
Yeah.
If you turn it off now, we'll be able to bring you back on real quick. Okay. Well, unfortunately, Matt, I'm sorry we're not going to be able to bring you on, but next time for sure. And I'm so sorry about this, but the technical issues are insurmountable. Alexander, I just want to thank you so much for having been on this broadcast. And please stick around after the end of the show so I can just have a few private words with you so that we can talk about our meeting of the big conspiracy club that we're having later today, where we're going to decide the fate of nations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And well, we've decided already that you're going to take China. I'm going to take India and Saudi Arabia, and Alex, I suppose, is going to take Russia and Western Europe. Yeah, we'll figure something out.
Why not? I think so.
By the way, but in all seriousness, it's always a pleasure to speak to you, and thank you so much for your kindness for having come on the broadcast. Chat, why don't you send off Alexander with a lot of +1s, because Alexander's always certainly deserved it, and so it's such a pleasure to have him on. And I hope that you all enjoyed the show. By the way, Alexander, where can people find you? I did put the link to your description, but please go ahead.
So you can find me on the Duran, on YouTube, Rumble, Locals, Odyssey, all of these places. And you can also find me on Alexander Mercouris, my own channel, which you can also find in all of these same places, as well as, of course, YouTube.
Yes. Alexander's the link to Alexander's channel is in the description below, and from there it's very easy to go to any of the platforms that he's on, especially his Telegram channel, which I understand is really blossoming. So yeah, go check it out. I want to thank you all for having watched this episode, and I will catch you next time. Take care.